Hey, thanks everyone for coming today to this Food for Thought presentation. My name is Sarah Cooper. I teach in the Department of City Planning here at U of M, and I'm happy today to introduce Dr. Jeffrey Lowe. Jeffrey Lowe is an associate professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy at Texas Southern University. Dr. Lowe's research focuses on social justice and racial equity concerns within the context of community development, as well as diversification of the planning profession. His scholarship advances understanding and policy recommendations for Gulf Coast revitalization post-disaster recovery, innovations in community-based planning, resistance to gentrification, and philanthropy. He is the author of Rebuilding Communities the Public Trust Way, Community Foundation Assistance to CDC's 1980 to 2000, as well as other publications including articles in Planning Practice and Research, Housing Policy Debate, the Journal of Urban Affairs, and Urban Geography. Dr. Lowe's service to the planning profession includes his recent appointment to chair the newly established Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning Presidential Anti-Racist Task Force. He is a founding member and past co-chair of the Planners of Color Interest Group of ACSP, as well as the past chair of ACSP's Committee on Diversity and chair of the Planning and the Black Community Division of the American Planning Association. At present, Dr. Lowe is a member of the Grounded Solutions Network, a community land trust research collaborative, and a research fellow at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research at Rice University. So welcome, Dr. Lowe, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Sarah. I really appreciate it. And I'd like to thank you all at the University of Manitoba for inviting me to give this presentation today. Much of this presentation is about planning history, Black planning history, and the history of Blacks in professional planning in the United States of America. This is a relatively new research stream that I'm embarking upon. And some of you may have perhaps heard some of what I am about to introduce. But given that I believe that many of the audience here may be students and may be unfamiliar with this history, I believe that this is a good place to start and share information that perhaps we can talk about it as I attempt to create this historical narrative. So I am starting off my presentation by just sharing with you my values that I seek to place into the context with this history on the Black professional planning experience. That would really take us into where most professional planners, and I would say the forerunners, if you will, within that experience, where they have congregated over the years. And that is with the Planning and the Black Community Division of the American Planning Association. From there, I will then proceed to really talk about two elements of that experience, their influence within the professional society of the American Planning Association, as well as, and this is where I hope we can have some comments at least, as well as, in addition to that experience, tentacles within the Association of Collegiate Schools of planning, and then I'll conclude with some thoughts. Okay, so I should begin, and I really wanted the students to share this with uh, students because I do think it's important that while we as faculty often create knowledge and convey that knowledge to you, and hopefully it will prove to make you better professionals and even perhaps one day pursue scholarship on your own, you all also influence our thinking, particularly with your inquiries and just conversation. And over the years, as I have taught planning history courses, it typically has been the case that as I talk about the impact, certainly of major figures on planning, the question often comes up from my students of color, my Black students, brown students, and others as to where are the African Americans in that history and what contribution have they made to planning practice. And so that was really something that drove me to engage in more more deeply in terms of what African American contributions have been to the American planning experience. So much of my research really looks at this from the standpoint of racial inclusion. You know, the opportunity for African American planners to be involved in shaping the field and practice. And you know, there's so much, I think, conversation around inclusion of late, certainly because of the various social movements taking place today, particularly with, I believe, the Black Lives Matter movement. But I think in addition to that, it's helping us to perhaps view diversity and more deeply, and with the understanding that you know, diversity and inclusion perhaps aren't the same thing. Certainly aren't. But in order to have real diversity, there needs to be uh, inclusion that is fair and certainly just. And this is where the focus in on social justice comes into play. Even for a professional organization, how much of their um, influence influences our professional and scholarly societies. How does it resonate from the bottom up to influence uh, our work and our future endeavors? So I would like to begin by really talking about the early years. Planning is, as disciplines go, many would say that planning is a relatively young field, about uh, about approximately 110, 15 years old. And for much of that time, as the field was emerging, there was an absence of the uh, Black planner. But it also sets the context for when African American or Black planners emerged on the scene. So we have, in many instances, we teach that planning emerged in 1909 with the plan of Chicago, uh, the first city to have a comprehensive plan. And as the field emerged, the major tool, and even to this day, many would consider the major tool that planners often use to influence the built environment and quality of life is zoning. And many of the uh, zoning that initially arrived on the scene in those early days, besides planning, certainly first beginning with zoning ordinances in New York City to improve quality of life, preventing or restricting, for example, heights of buildings. Zoning emerged certainly on the field uh, as a public safety or health mechanism, ensuring that some buildings weren't taller than others to ensure uh, good ventilation and what have you. When it comes looking at this through the lens of race, we find that in many places, uh, zoning was undertaken to segregate uh, neighborhoods um, that were populated by different races. So we have racial zoning coming on the scene first, certainly in Baltimore and other places. Even today, we certainly experience the aftermath or the de facto legacy of this zoning, as in many neighborhoods where Black people live, and certainly historically being prevented from living in more integrated neighborhoods, often the value of neighborhoods where Blacks live is lower than those that where whites live. And so we have the Hopkins versus um, City of Richmond decision that upheld racial zoning in 1915. And it really wasn't until the zoning was declared unconstitutional in the 20s uh, that cities began to certainly remove them. However, the influence remained. And then as we began to see the construction of freeways, public housing, redlining, there are a number of readings, both scholarly as well as in now the popular press, that speaks to the impact of planning initiatives that had an impact on Black communities, and I would say a negative impact on Black communities. And while and Tim Wise writes about this, while we have the Housing Act of 1949 coming on the scene, which basically says that every American, and is aspirational, that every American has the right to decent housing in a safe environment. While that was really a policy set into place to improve neighborhoods, to provide good, stable housing and neighborhoods with buried and surface infrastructure. it was a social good. It was, and many would argue, was co-opted and became one to carry out economic interests. And many African American or Black neighborhoods were razed, many households were displaced, and hence urban renewal became known as uh, Negro removal. It's at this moment as well, seeing the experiences in many of the early planners or first generation planners that I've had the experience to speak with. It is at this moment, the moment of urban renewal, which lasts approximately 25 years. It is at this moment that we began to see um, Black people entering into the profession of planning. So as I mentioned before, planning emerges as a field in 1909, and it is in 1952 that, as best as we know it, the first African American earns a professional degree almost 40 years later, approximately. The first African American earns a professional degree in urban planning. Samuel Cullors, he received his undergraduate degree from Fisk University, which is a historical, what is known as an HBCU, a historically Black college and or university um, in Nashville, Tennessee. He then goes on to MIT and graduates in 1952. Um, Sam Cullors holds a number of positions upon graduation from MIT. He goes on to work with the Redevelopment Authority in Hartford, Connecticut, and subsequently, after spending a few years in Hartford, he becomes more or less international and involved in urban renewal. He worked on urban studies upon leaving Hartford in Bangkok, Thailand, and uh, in the early 60s, he arrives in Canada and undertakes and directs the urban renewal study for the Metropolitan Toronto Planning Board before returning to the United States, working in uh, working in Chicago, and then California. He becomes intricately involved in the profession of planning, primarily through the American Society of Planning officials, and upon the emergence of the American Planning Association in the late 70s, he also becomes very active there, and eventually starting his own business in environmental planning, as well as becoming the director of the Sacramento Valley section of the California APA. I am continuing to uh, do more work to find out more about Sam Cullors. But for now, um, uh, this is what I've been able to determine, and certainly his impact in California and other places, I believe, um, helped to set the tone for uh, the work of other planners within APA. I also include here um, Robert Weaver. Robert Weaver was not necessarily um, a planner. In fact, he was not a trained planner. However, Weaver had a real impact on professional planners. It was in his, he was the first African American, let me begin there. He was the first African American to hold a cabinet position in a presidential administration under Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson. He became the secretary of the new Department of Housing and Urban uh, Development. And it was under Johnson um, in the administration, having learned the negative impact of urban renewal, that the Model Cities program was born. As a part of Model Cities, certainly emerged the Community Development Grant Program that ensured citizen participation in the process of CDBG funding. But also important to Model Cities, a component which was known as the 701 program was created that provided funding for minorities and women to earn professional degrees and professional degrees in planning. So, because of the 701 program, we began to see the training, the professional training of a number of um, Blacks in urban planning. We also see, we also begin to see at this time the emergence of a number of uh, urban planning, urban studies programs throughout the United States being formed in the universities in the mid to late 60s, early 70s. Upon leaving HUD, Robert Weaver went on to join the faculty in the urban studies program at Hunter College. And that program not only um, branded itself as a program focused on uh, planning, equity planning through the work of Paul Davidoff, its founder, or advocacy planning. But as I have looked through the historical record and archives, um, it also, again, marketed itself to the African American community, such as through publications in the community and newspapers. There are clippings or advertisements from the Amsterdam News, which is the premier Black newspaper in New York City, announcing um, opportunities and encouraging potential students to apply to the program. Charles Allen. Charles Allen was the first African American to become a director of a major city in the United States. which was Gary, Indiana. Charles was also a founding member of, um, of the first uh, organization or society of Black planners. Again, I mentioned this cadre that was coming on board in the late 60s, early 70s. And as a way of networking with each other, they created the National Association of Planners. He was also involved in the American Society of Planning Officials, joining its governing board in the 1970s. Now, I need to mention that with the ASPO, and this is going to become really important later on, that in order to have representation and influence, the ASPO appointed members from minority groups to the board. Charles earned a bachelor's in architecture from Hampton University and went on to earn his master's in urban planning from Columbia University. In addition to becoming the planning director in Gary, he went on to serve as assistant planning director and director in the city of Newport News, Virginia, where he eventually also becomes mayor of the city. Now, we have these two influential or important planners involved early on. But an apex moment, I argue, happened in 1980 with the American Planning Association. And that is the founding of the Planners and the Black Community Division. Now, I have not been able to find records from the National Association of Planners, or NAP. Most of what I know or have found out has been primarily through oral interviews and conversations. Right now, it doesn't appear that none of those early records were saved by some of the leadership at that time. But NAP folded in the late 70s, as I've been able to determine thus far. But planners wanted to have an influence on the field, and they believed that it was important to include themselves and participate in the activities of the newly formed American Planning Association, which was in 1978, which was a merger between ASPO and another entity known as the American Institute of Planners, or AIP. And AIP is what we know today, for the most part, as being the association. Is the arm that grants certification for planners in our field, or AICP, the American Institute of Certified Planners. So the more social arm joins with the more technical planners to form APA in 1978, and two Black planners come along and they lead the effort for the formation of an interest group in, um, in the APA. William Harris, um, who is pictured here on your left, happened to be a doctoral student at the University of Washington. And while at the University of Washington, he also meets a master's student. Bill Harris was the first African American to earn a PhD in planning, and Rodney Proctor was began his career as being the only African American in the city of Seattle to work on um, environmental uh, impact statements. So he was engaged in environmental planning. They lead the charge again to form the planning and the Black community division, which um, uh, really wanted to carry out a purpose of providing a forum where planners could and APA members could address issues of significance in the Black community. This was really an important time. Not only do you see a need for such an organization because of the ending of of NAP, but it is the emergence of the Reagan administration, and many African American planners and others were really concerned about what this would mean for not only planning, but planning in the Black community. And so they really saw the need to come together, advance the interest of the Black community themselves, and really begin to address this notion of equitable development. They sought to do it primarily through three objectives. Uh, the first was to address issues of significance within the Black community. So at every early on, at every APA conference, wherever it was located, they would come together and they would undertake activities that would have an impact or try to influence and promote planning within the cities where the APA conference was held, by working with communities to talk about issues related to planning. Uh, the the PBCD also in the early 2000s, they began to hold their own conferences. And as they met amongst themselves, a huge portion of those conferences were working with the communities where they were meeting, typically meeting for a period of 3 days. Oftentimes, at least two of those 3 days were working with the community where they found themselves. In 2007, they worked with, held a conference in Gary, Indiana. And at this conference in Gary, Indiana, they produced a plan for equitable development among, among the or along its major corridor, which was Broadway. as a part of, and this is just a picture here showing the work with young people or the youth, which was a component of that vision for Broadway. I should mention that at this conference, there were approximately 80 to 100 planners that joined and invited other Black affiliated organizations, such as the National Association of Minority Architects, or NOMA, to work together uh, with the community in developing this equitable development plan. The plan was eventually incorporated. Uh, Not only did it win an award from APA that I mentioned on the previous slide, but the plan uh, was incorporated into the comprehensive plan for the city of Gary, and today has had some impact, not only in the design or streetscaping, but also the transportation linkages that are now taking place in Gary. I think as planners, we recognize that oftentimes with our plans, we may not necessarily see immediate benefits. Specifically, sometimes when you go back 10 or 20 years later, you can really see oftentimes the impact on one's plans. The second objective was to enhance the visibility and the role of Black planners within uh, the organization. And so in 1984, a task force was formed. Again, as I previously mentioned, the Planning and the Black Community Division was formed in 1980. Prior to that formation, um, another, what's known in APA as a population division, was formed in 1979, and that was Women in Planning. And so the two groups, along with others in APA, came together to produce this report. And uh, and as you can see here, um, the members of that task force, some of the names might even be familiar to you. Aside from Rodney Proctor, again, founder of PBCD, you see here Paul David Dolph, who we read about often in planning history and theory for advocacy planning, and the founding director of the Urban Affairs and Planning program at Hunter College. Carol Barrett has written extensively dealing with planning ethics. Um, and others here. And what's important to note about this report was within the newly formed APA, or what I find interesting, which fits the mission of PBCD, is this focus on inclusion and having influence. And in the report, there's an emphasis on, our values and what values do we hold primary. And one value that resonated was this notion of equity, and equity versus democracy. So as APA would choose its leadership was chosen by votes. And although committees were formed, nomination committees were formed that identified African Americans and other groups of individuals known at that time as minorities and women were being identified, they weren't getting elected to the board. And in the report, they talk about having equitable representation to influence the direction and perhaps um, equity or equitable inclusion should be primary to democracy in order to have this representation. And so what we find is what APA ended up doing was creating um, an at-large position where over the years that seems to have been the plate, well, the seat, um, the elected seat that many African Americans have held. And here, this timeline is somewhat incomplete, but here I share with you those African Americans who were elected um, to the board, and many of them holding the at large seat. Another outcome, and I believe that my time is about to wrap up, and I'm going to close it out here. But networking and sharing opportunities was really important for PBCD. Sharing opportunities, sharing information, connecting with planners of color, uh, people of color. Um, uh, at one time, there was an indigenous uh, planning uh, interest group within APA. PBCD helped to get that group started. Today we have the Latinos in planning, and I believe the name has changed, but Latinos in planning certainly exist. PBCD, early on, their members met with PBCD, were a part of PBCD helped to get that started. And I would argue even more recently, um, uh, uh, well, or say within the last 12 years or so, um, PBCD played a significant role in, as many of its members were also part of the academy, PBCD, through hosting um, a dinner with Black scholars and other allies and people of color back in 2006 played a significant role in the emergence of the Planners of Color interest group. And so I'm about to close it on here, but I do want to mention as this group began formulating itself um, with this mission and vision to advance the academy and the issues of scholars of color, as well as communities of color within ACSP. Um, we have here a major person who helped to as its founding co-chair, along with Teresa Vasquez. Uh, they really played, June Manning Thomas played a huge role in providing legitimacy and credibility along with many junior faculty of color. I would say approximately 95% of us were junior members in helping to get our uh, planners of color interest group within ACSP uh, going and institutionalized in a way that I believe that at least within the academy, we're beginning to realize um, some true impact. Not only are a number of prior to the formation of POSIC, a number of planners of color were having serious issues with their mid-career reviews as well as tenure. Um, Pipelines have been developed, and today we have many more scholars of color earning tenure and within the academy. And if I could just move forward, I would say we've certainly had a huge impact on the scholarship within the field, bringing focus and attention to scholarship. Uh, I have listed here just a few um, uh, works that I believe have come out of the efforts of uh, POSIC. And my way of determining this is um, based on the authors of the works and the editors mentioning that their work arose from a POSIC conference session or workshop or roundtable. So these are just a few for your review. As you can see, um, uh, its influence that POSIC is beginning or has had on the Planning Academy. So, in conclusion, I think that this historical perspective really shows that, in my mind, that black the Black planning experience historically is rather contemporary. You began to see the first planner again emerge, professional planner emerge in the mid um, 50s, almost 40 years after the emergence of planning as a profession. A cadre, a small cadre, but a cadre nonetheless, uh, is forming and in the early 80s, and they work collectively. Many with professionals as well as scholars to have an influence on on the field. And while there was this responsibility to or mission to advance inclusion and have an impact that would lead to better quality of life in uh, in on the ground or in our communities, I think there's a question as to whether or not we're we are seeing, especially from the standpoint of APA, the American Planning Association, do we really see inclusion, diversity, and a sense of belonging, or is some of that, you know, being co-opted in a way that perhaps promotes visually diversity, but having a real impact on the field? Um, is it really taking place in a way that is advancing diversity and social justice? So that concludes my presentation. I think I went a few minutes over, but I thank you for your attention. And now I welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lowe. That was a wonderful presentation, very in-depth analysis of the history of African American planning and in the U.S. Uh, so yeah, we're a little bit, we're just about 1 o'clock, but hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please note in the chat. I'll call on you, and if you'd like to turn your video on to ask your question, you can do that. Otherwise, I can just read it out. So we have one question so far from Jordan Yin. Jordan, do you want to turn your camera on and ask the question, or should I just read it? Hearing nothing, I will read the question. So the question is, as of this year, APA is no longer adding to their list of national planning pioneers, including, Daniel Burnham, Lewis Mumford, Catherine Bauer, etc. And the list does not include any individual persons of color. Does this limit the ability or seriousness of purpose of APA going forward to recognize previously under-recognized historical contributions, for example, Robert Weaver, Benjamin Banneker, etc., of African American and other underrepresented planners and influencers?
In my opinion, it does. If I can use an example quickly, and I see APA as an umbrella organization, um, that attempts to function more like a trade organization, and I don't think it takes criticism well. So one example is that I can give is that APA began to get some pushback, certainly from PBCD, in terms of what it was doing to advance um, planning amongst students and others who should be entering the field back in about the turn of the century in the late 90s. And so what they began to do, I think, uh, what they ended up doing was stop providing information about the percentage of its membership who were African American. More recently, I have been informed that in its next census, it will begin to include that information. And perhaps what is going on is, quite frankly, I think as scholars and as planning scholars and historians, we haven't really documented the experiences of African American planners. So there's very little that we know. And that may be, so rather than perhaps dealing with the situation, perhaps that is why they've chosen not to highlight some of these persons who we have historically identified as as founders within our field, because in order for it to be fair and equitable, there must be an acknowledgement that little is known about people of color within planning. On the other hand, I see this as a gap that could be filled by some of us planning scholars and historians.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Sarah Manteufel's question, as I know she's a student and I'd like to prioritize students, and then Susan will get to you just after that. Sarah Manteufel asks, how can planning associations not only uplift voices of Black and minority voices in planning, but also better assist in preventing burnout or the dissuasion of planners from continuing in the field when they may feel unrepresented or unheard?
That's a very good question. If I could perhaps, use the example of planning in the Black Community Division, I'm not sure that we can really depend on, I don't believe that we can really depend on our major organizations such as APA, right, or state or province, perhaps, organizations to take the lead. It's my experience, and I believe what this narrative shows is that the indigenous groups and other groups of color, they have to do it amongst themselves. Now, how do we identify each other, especially if we're spread out? Um, how do we identify each other and do so? Perhaps what, early on, certainly what PBCD did was use their national conferences to link up with others, and so it really created this, I think, a more of a bottom up movement, connecting with people who have credibility within these organizations who are willing, to provide resources and allies. So I think in many ways you have to force the inclusion. So I think that's probably, I think that's the lesson, one of the lessons I think that comes from PBCD. Um, and I think I would argue it spilled over into into ACSP. And I think they're critical moments, more broadly speaking, that helps to fuel such efforts. I think the social movements that and the movement around the mattering of Black lives and Indigenous people of color that we're experiencing now is a moment that we should realize and we have to use uh, to 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 um, to influence um, organizations in a way that it leads to creating the type of environments and places that we want. I hope that helps answer the question.
Thank you. Okay, Susan Feinstein, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi, Jeffrey. I thought that was a really interesting talk in which I learned stuff I didn't know. One of the things I was thinking, though, and I wonder what your reaction to this is that there's a tendency, and I guess I would even include you when you were vice student, for African Americans to focus on community development and maybe economic development, but that it's in areas like transportation and environmental justice and some of the other things that planners do, but that you practically see no African American representation. And I was wondering if you don't think that there's a kind of over specialization among African American planners.
That's a very good um, question, Susan. Thank you. I'm not sure. When I review, so for example, in some of the early documents that I reviewed as I'm embarking on this research stream here, even the task force report on minorities and women, um, they mentioned that APA should in fact focus on areas of interest to the Black community. And specifically in that report, they name housing and community development with a specific focus on um, housing that meets the desires of households um, single-headed households, primarily headed by women with children. And certainly during that era, we know there was a lot of conversation around feminization of poverty. And even now we have a housing crisis where that issue is still a concern. I think when we look at many of the uh, works of scholars today, that there are many who are specializing and concentrating in areas that represents the breadth of planning, including transportation. Perhaps what is missing is, in the academy, we haven't done a very good job of increasing the number of, of people of color who are entering the profession or even scholarship that could go into these different areas of expertise and bring equity and justice to the fore in the literature, into focus in the literature. So I think that's what's really needed on this front. That if you look at, and certainly I should mention this, that while um, students and faculty of color within the Planning Academy in the United States is increasing, and some of that has to do with the fact of the decrease of students within planning in the United States. So that's bringing up the numbers a bit more. But in the main, faculty of color and students of color are still underrepresented, in the academy. That might focus in on some of the breadth of planning scholarship, and I think that's a problem that uh, you know still requires some work.
Thank you. So we are a little bit over time, so I think we'll wrap up here. I just wanted to note that Gala Kordienko added a note in the chat about Black women planners early on too, and she highlights, or they highlight, Dorothy May Richardson, and there's a link to know more about Dorothy May Richardson. So if you are interested, please click on the link and learn more. So thank you so much, Dr. Lowe, for your presentation today, and thank you to everybody for coming. Yeah.
Yes, you're welcome, sir, and thank you for inviting me.